Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Over the last weeks, we have seen incredible unity among transatlantic allies in the response to Russia's brutal war in Ukraine. But as the world becomes increasingly more complex, we will need that kind of unity on so many core issues, such as the use of artificial intelligence, data governance, and digital rights. Over the last years, Europe has moved very quickly on its digital agenda of tech regulation, while the United States, the home of many of the world's major tech companies, has been slower to enact meaningful policy. At the same time, authoritarian states, most notably Russia and China, are developing and deploying technologies in the service of surveillance and censorship, with the aim of undermining a truly open and interoperable internet. Despite more recent efforts to build greater US-EU cooperation on tech policies, democracies are not yet united on a clear vision for defending and promoting a democratic digital domain that's based on our shared values and principles. The Digital Innovation Initiative at CEPA aims to do just that: advance and advocate for greater democratic cooperation on tech policy. The conversations today will dive into how we can build a digital alliance for the 21st century. Before we get into it, I ask everyone to check out our brand new content stream, Bandwidth, at cepa.org. That's cepa.org, that explains the key policy debates happening across the Atlantic and provides much-needed context on complex legislation such as the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and many more. We have an incredible lineup of discussions for you today. The first, led by my dear colleague and CEPA editor Bill Etchison, will take us into the conversation on how we can build that digital alliance for the 21st century. After that, I will see you again for a special fireside chat with myself and Tim Wu, Special Assistant to the President for Technology and Competition Policy. Thank you so much for joining us. Please remember to go to cepa.org and look for Bandwidth. And now, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Alina, and good morning or good afternoon to all of those who are attending today's event. I'm Bill Etchison, the editor of Bandwidth. Bandwidth is the new CEPA Digital Innovation Initiative, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this wonderful panel discussion. We have good representatives on both sides of the Atlantic. In Brussels, we have MEP Iva Majdal, a key member of the European Parliament from Bulgaria. And in Washington, we have Adam Kovacevic, founder and CEO of the Chamber of Progress. MEP Majdal is a member of the European People's Party, or EPP, and a leading thought leader on digital issues in Europe. She currently serves as the rapporteur on the AI Act within the Industry, Research, and Energy Committee, and has previously served as the EPP rapporteur on leading digital files, including the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. She has also led the annual Regulation for Innovation Conference in Brussels. Adam Kovacevic is a former Google executive who ran the company's Washington office. He is founder and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, which is a new center-left tech industry policy coalition in Washington promoting technology's progressive future. So let's dive right into the contours of digital regulation at a time when Transatlantic Technology Alliance faces major issues and is at a crossroads. Let's start the debate with Ukraine. It's the immediate crisis, and in addition to the war on the ground, there's a war in cyberspace about information insecurity. Russia's moved to cut off its country from the global internet, and for their part, the global platforms have moved to remove or demote Russian state media content. Eva, have the big tech companies in your mind done enough, or should they do more? What should be done to counter Russia's potential cyber offensive?
Well, so first of all, I think what we're witnessing in Ukraine has really focused the mind and brought into very clear terms the dangers and challenges we face. And of course, those dangers and challenges were there before, but they're just so much more vivid now. And just because nothing is new, I think the warning signs have been out there for us for years, be it cyber attacks, be it fake news, the spread of disinformation, election interference. And I think for quite some time, we have been giving insufficient investment in certain parts of technology on one hand from a EU side, and on the other hand, we've been paying a little less attention on what responsibility companies should be taking. So what we're trying to do now is to tackle these issues on two levels. One could say one is a short-term one and the other one is a long-term one. You have seen that we have put sanctions on RT, on Sputnik immediately, and we have actively started discussing with tech companies to remove this information from their platforms as a priority. I think when we speak about the long-term strategy, I think we need to make sure we have a clear plan of how to fight disinformation, election interference, but also have very concrete structures that are here to stay. And I think this is where the role of private companies and of tech companies also kicks in. So a few suggestions that I gave over the past couple of weeks and that we're working now is I've called for the creation of EU disinformation war room that brings together the platforms, the experts, EU officials to kind of try to target the actions of Russia during this war. And in the long run, what we want this disinformation war room to do is to help deal with imminent threats under a more established and a structure that's already trained and practiced. So this is one thing we would like to see where we would like to collaborate with the tech companies. But from an EU side, we think we could speed our efforts on a couple of other areas where on one hand, we could have a more robust and ambitious cybersecurity directive, the so-called NIS directive, because we want to make sure we are better equipped, we have more resources and clear mandates how to deal with cyber attacks in the EU. We also want to make sure we have sufficient funding when it comes to cybercrime and disinformation. And we already have certain initiatives in that area, but we believe we need to make sure that they're better prepared, as I said, also in terms of funding. And finally, again, going back to the private sector, I think we need to harness the potential of AI to make sure it detects deep fakes as well as detect patterns in how disinformation is basically shared across platforms. And I think here is where perhaps platforms are able to do more. We don't have, I think, the resources, or that's not our job. These sorts of statements are simply not well perceived anymore, not just by policymakers, but also by society. So I think platforms will have to assume that responsibility. And we see that this is happening, I would say, in a rather slow pace. So very often there are requests by governments, but they're not quickly tackled enough. And I think there are a number of things that could be done. For example, platforms could increase their moderation teams in all languages. They could strengthen their fact-checking capabilities. And I think this will be helpful in the short midterm. In the long term, of course, we also know that citizens themselves have a responsibility. So we try to make sure that there's more investments in educating our citizens. So digital literacy, having a skilled population, being ready to judge what they see online or how to tackle it. It's going to be very important. And perhaps finally, to wrap up on this point, I think it will be important to look into this challenge, not just as Europe or the US, or just there's one problem and that's cybersecurity or disinformation. I think we need to look a little bit in a bigger terms and see the bigger picture, because I think ultimately, the war in Ukraine has initiated a precedented unity among the European Union, but also international democratic allies. And this cannot be just, a momentum that happens now. I hope this would bring a fundamental shift in how the free world approaches global threats and challenges ahead of us. And we have seen also private sector playing its part in that responsibility over the past couple of weeks.
Thanks. Adam, is the view the same in Washington? I mean, specifically, I think, is it a positive development that democracies say you have to ban certain websites because we don't like that speech or we think it's evil, and is that opening the door to autocrats to make the same demands and put pressure on private sector in a way that may be less comfortable, in places that would be less comfortable?
Sure.
Turkey,
sure,
China, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And first of all, thank you for having me. Look, I think Ms. Maydel's comments really point out the moment we're in. As we gather here, the end of March 2022, I see one good sign for digital transatlanticism and one very bad sign, which I think we'll probably get into in a bit. And the good sign is the way in which I think the U.S. and EU have recognized in the last several weeks that that we have a common bond, which is we want to promote digital democracy and digital human rights. Ms. Maydel is absolutely right. Information quality is a huge component now of warfare. There's as much of an information war going on as Russia and Ukraine try to shape perceptions of the invasion, as there is an actual a military operation going on. And I don't think there's any doubt that Europe and the US have locked arms. And I would even add further that I think that all of the concerns that Ms. Maydel and other European officials have rightly raised about misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, all of those concerns have been acted upon by the US-based platforms, by Facebook, by YouTube, by Google, by Twitter. It doesn't mean that platforms do every single thing that policymakers urge them to do, especially when that's in more of the bully pulpit as opposed to passing laws. I think there's a healthy debate to be had about, for example, how much services restrict access to information within Russia to ordinary Russians. But Europe, I think the EU demanded that tech platforms block RT and Sputnik. American services abided by that, right? And I think that both Europe, this sort of shows to me that both Europe and American policymakers, if given a choice between American platforms being in the driver's seat of these decisions, or Russian or Chinese platforms, Yandex, Baidu, TikTok, they're not going to make the same calls that the American platforms make. They're not going to optimize for democracy and human rights the same way that the Western platforms have. And I think that's an important thing. So I think, the analyst Ben Thompson talks about the four internets: American internet, a European internet, a Chinese internet, and an Indian internet. My hope that this moment, is a moment of recognition that Europe and America have a lot in common, are wanting to promote our shared values through digital openness, free expression. That's superior to the Chinese and Russian models, and it's been a very positive moment for being reminded of the shared values we have in that area, particularly around speech.
Yeah, Adam, let's continue with maybe an area where there's less agreement, the Digital Markets Act and specific European actions to regulate American big tech. It looks like imminently Europe will go ahead and pass this so-called gatekeeper law, the Digital Markets Act. Do you think the focus is correct? Do you think the remedies that are being discussed are correct, or is there going to be a transatlantic divide on this issue?
Yeah, I'm very concerned that at the same time we have a lot of unity between the U.S. and Europe on particularly online speech issues. We are about to take Europe is about to take what I view as a discriminatory step backwards with the Digital Markets Act, and act towards American tech companies in a way that would never be tolerated from the American government acting discriminatorily towards European companies. I thought it was encouraging several months ago when the US-EU Trade and Technology Council was formed by leaders on both sides committing to partner to work through security issues, avoid unnecessary barriers to trade. But I view the Digital Markets Act text that's going to be finalized this week as a violation of that principle of non-discrimination. It only covers U.S. companies. It seems to exempt European, Russia, Chinese rivals from that kind of scrutiny. And even when the dispute arose between the Parliament wanting a narrower targeting of U.S. firms versus the Commission's view of having a less targeted towards America and firms approach, this seems to be headed towards the more narrow targeting of only U.S. firms. I think that is going to damage what I consider to be transatlantic values around due process, privacy, security, protection of intellectual property rights. And again, I think that if American authorities had said, we're going to introduce a new regulation that only targets SAP, BMW, Louis Vuitton, European firms only, but not American competitors, European officials would rightly protest. And I think that the Biden administration has been right to protest as well. I think it's a step backwards.
Eva, your response?
You would like me to respond?
Yes.
So first of all, we are still in negotiations on the DMA Act. I was one of the people that were part of the discussion team, and I led on behalf of my group the discussions for the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. Initially, I would be the person in the parliament always trying to see less intervention in the business, but only when such is necessary. And we have waited for quite some time to gear up knowledge, perhaps, to kind of round our thoughts where legislation, particularly for the DMA, is necessary, and finally be able to act. I would say that for our American viewers here, or transatlantic viewers, is that we have the Commission, which is our executive arm, and the Parliament. And the Parliament this time has been a little bit more ambitious on a number of points. And I can go through some of those points in a little bit. And I have to say that I have been more on the side of the Commission of caution, even though that is not the way it's perceived by our American partners. I also have to say, when we speak about details on the scope part, which is currently being negotiated, it doesn't seem like the legislation will target only American companies. It will be targeting also European companies and perhaps some others as well. I think that's very important to note, and that's probably how the file will be wrapped up. I think most of the discussion when it comes to the DMA, from our side, the way we see it, it has been mainly around interoperability, around encryption. I said to Bill earlier, I will not go into too many details, but I think it's important that where we were discussing is to try to make sure there's definitions that provide legal clarity, but they can also place, in the same time, people in or out of categories, which can have a far-reaching consequences for the business model itself. And so this is why, of course, there are still intense negotiations when it comes to the conversation around competitions, about how fines will be structured. And I think it is essential that we get this right, as much as it might sound like a cliche. But these are some big precedent-setting decisions that we are facing. And so I've always been the one trying to ask for more caution and try to, take not necessarily baby steps, because we took no steps for quite some time, but, be proportionate in what we are asking for, because sometimes there would be requests even for the fines themselves to be between starting as a 5% up to 25%. And, this gives also no room for the Commission to maybe investigate smaller issues, because they won't be able to put an appropriate fine. I think what's important is that we have, and I said that, legal, as much on the DMA legal clarity as possible, because if we leave room for interpretation, whether it be by gatekeepers or by the enforcement, digi competition in this case, it will be very difficult for these key files to be successful. And ultimately, what we want to make sure is not to, as I said, I'm always very cautious, but what this file wants to do is not to target, it's not about targeting the biggest, it's about bringing more competition on our market, giving more choice to consumers and more opportunities for other players. I know that in practice this is difficult. I know that it's not about just this law, it's about many other things. And this is why I often say that our legislation should be some sort of a jigsaw. And what I mean is that we cannot create legislation in silos. So with the DMA, you cannot think there's just this legislation and it's going to fix everything. It's going to create our startups, our unicorns, and Europe all of a sudden will flourish as, a competitive tech market to the US and to other nations. I think it's going to be bad for citizens, particularly bad for businesses, but also bad for regulators if we make legislation in silos. It will be important to again look at the bigger picture and all these different pieces of the digital puzzle, because it's not just the DMA. There's the DSA, there's the Data Act, there's the AI Act. We need to see how all these pieces fit together, that they don't overlap with other pieces of existing regulation. And also equally, they must leave gaps to be exploited. We cannot make sure that there's a regulatory framework from everything, then business will not be able to breathe and innovate, will not be able to create at all, be it big, small, gatekeeper, or a startup. So I think it's particularly important to see it a little bit in broader terms.
Yeah, to be fair, Adam, I mean, a lot of the problems that I think European policymakers have seen are also perceived in America. Antitrust has proven to be very slow. Big tech is very big and has to take on more responsibilities, be it know your customer or other types of responsibilities. Do you think there's a way in which we could square this circle and find a transatlantic accord about how to regulate big tech?
Well, I think that you're right. The issues in the DMA have also been proposed though I thankfully, from my perspective, not enacted here in the United States. I don't think they even have a majority of support in Congress. But I do think they do point out a difference of which actor, which entity policymakers are trying to support or look out for. I was struck about a month ago, the CEO of Trivago, which is a European travel search site, gave an interview, I think, or maybe it was around their earnings, saying they're looking forward to the enactment of the Digital Markets Act because it will hobble Google in travel search and give Trivago an opportunity to gain market share. And it was, I think, an honest reflection of what probably a number of businesses, Yelp, Spotify, kind of hope comes from the Digital Markets Act. And if policymakers view it as their role to hobble Google to help Trivago, then by all means, the Digital Markets Act, I think, achieves that goal. But I think the flip side of that is that for a consumer who goes to Google today and searches for flights and finds flight information, the DMA will probably prevent them from being able to do that. So that's an integrated convenience that will not be accessible to European consumers anymore. When an iPhone is sold in Europe, it might not be able to come with Apple's apps pre-installed like FaceTime or iMessage, because that would be discriminatory and disadvantageous to competing apps like Zoom, for example, or Facebook Messenger. But a Samsung phone, because Samsung is not covered by the Digital Markets Act, could come with its own apps pre-installed. I think that would be disadvantageous to Apple from a competitive standpoint, but also disadvantageous to European iPhone customers. So I think that the Digital Markets Act puts a finger on the scale for what I would call the supplier in this case, as some of the US proposals do, but at the expense of the consumer. And I think in this case, it's also in a way that singles out American firms, but not their foreign competitors. It's going to put the American services at a disadvantage. For some, that's a benefit of doing the Digital Markets Act. And my point is that when democracy is at stake, we've got these big picture, challenges like we see in Ukraine. Why is the EU intervening to help Trivago, right? What do you care more about? Google not being able to display a Google map, or Google blocking RT and Sputnik? It seems to me that we should be caring more about the big picture as opposed to the small. And I do appreciate that to Ms. Maydell's comments, there is a diversity of views even within the parliament on this. And I want to appreciate that and recognize that that the parliament is not of a single mind on this, and there is a diversity of views, and I think we appreciate that.
Yeah, Eva, one of the dangers I've heard in recent days is that the Digital Markets Act would allow Yandex or vKontakte to get all the data from Facebook and manipulate it as it sees fit, because it does allow competitors access to the gatekeeper's data and not vice versa. Do you think this is a real danger? What do you think about the charge that you're really just helping competitors, not consumers?
Well, so first of all, I think we need to wait till the final text is negotiated. And second of all, I share some of those concerns. But as I said, there's different opinions in the parliament, and some of us are in a minority with our opinions, so to say. I don't necessarily think, and this is why I say we need to be very careful how we finalize the DMA, because I'm not entirely sure that some of the things we believe the DMA will deliver, it will actually deliver for the European market or for consumers. And so this is why I'm very careful when discussing the DMA.
Okay, a related subject is digital sovereignty. We hear a lot of this coming out of the EU these days. The phrase, President Macron of France is particularly fond of it, Commissioner Breton here in Brussels. How do you understand this push for digital sovereignty? What does it mean? Is it pure protectionism? Is it something that is anti-American, or is it something pro-European and would promote competition?
I mean, I take digital sovereignty or strategic autonomy as one of those buzzwords that we hear very often spoken from policymakers. We see them written in papers, speeches, and so on and so forth. They're nice words to hear. And I think it depends when we were talking about digital sovereignty. Was it 2 years ago, 1 month ago, or today? And I think the European Union has to...
Last week in Versailles at the summit meant to... it became
so
a common theme
very
that
much
Ukraine
depends
meant
with who. Yeah, so I think it very much depends with who you talk in Europe and what they imply in these expressions. Let me tell you the way I see things. The way I see things is that, yes, Europe clearly has understood that in a number of areas, we need to speed our game because we cannot rely on failed supply chains, for example, or unreliable partners. Concrete examples, the CHIPS Act we are working on and speeding our production in the semiconductor space, or making sure that we have a better flow of data. And this is not private data, it's B2B data, B2G data, and so on and so forth. So we've understood we need to, put our hands in areas where we thought, well, we're fine without, being successful or relying on someone else. So that's good. But I think what we have to understand ever more so today is that we cannot do that without the support of our transatlantic partners. I mean, the EU and the US have the largest bilateral trade investment relationship. We have an integrated economic relationship, the most integrated economic relationship in the world. It's a unique partnership and it's an asset. And I think, forums and places like the TTC are a great platform for digital cooperation, but most importantly, not just to talk. They should not be a talking shop or a writing shop. They have to deliver on progress and they have to deliver on concrete projects. And this is why I have also been calling that the TCC comes up with some sort of a parliament dimension, because Parliament sometimes is able to speak more openly and move certain points faster together. I mean, we are both on both sides of the Atlantic. We are working on a CHIPS Act, on some sort of AI regulation on both sides, and many other areas as well. So I think if we have something like the TCC that is permanent, that the structure is able to evolve. And most importantly, now this structure is used to have different working groups working simultaneously. I think we need, whether it's working groups in terms of priority, it does not matter. We need topics in terms of priority. We need to put the most pressing and important topics that are out there for us in order for us to make sure we deliver for the businesses, but also for the citizens. I mean, I'm not an expert on privacy, but I really hope that we can get privacy Shield 2 in place soon rather than later. I mean, we are living a huge regulatory vacuum while having companies rely on contracts. Are they legally sound? Becoming too bureaucratic? It's not the sort of workable model we need to have nowadays. And I think this needs to be worked on and fixed as soon as possible. And trade. I don't work so much on the topic either, but whether we are discussing national security agreements or these agreements over reciprocity, we need to have an honest, some sort of legitimate way to make sure that, a legitimate way to safeguard our economic concerns when we have them, or to propel our economic ideas and possibilities that we have. So I think we have, a lot of areas where we can work together, and we do so. But I think now more than ever, we have to intensify that relationship. Otherwise, it will be really a lost opportunity.
Adam, are you reassured? Do you think Europe is becoming digitally protectionist, and also how would you respond to criticism of America with the Buy America Act, the subsidies going to chip makers? Aren't we guilty? Americans guilty of the same offense in that way?
Yeah, sure. I think that every country, and in the case of Europe, the European Union ought to take a serious look about its own domestic capacity, supply chains, R&D, and I don't think there's any negative. It's not inherently discriminatory for the EU or for Europe to invest in our own capacity, right? In our own ability to have domestic manufacturing, more reliable supply chains. All of that is terrific. Investments in education, investments in training, prepare your own workforce to have these jobs of the future. All of that is really smart. The problem is when countries and governments are then tempted to use kind of short-term discrimination as a tool in that toolbox, which I think, frankly, I don't know that I would support that if the U.S. were doing it either, because I think that we should abide by the traditional, particularly the traditional U.S.-EU transatlantic norm of open trade and non-discrimination towards each other. That's why I'm so concerned about the Digital Markets Act, because I think it departs from that very significantly. But the fact is, we are each other's most critical trading partner. That doesn't mean we can't invest. Each of us can't invest in our own capacity, but it does mean that we shouldn't single each other out for discriminatory regulation. And I think that I worry a lot about the future of the TTC, right? It is, as Ms. Maydell commented, it's meant to increase coordination and collaboration between the EU and the U.S. on these issues, but it's not. The EU is continuing to sort of barrel forward with some of these things, not just following the DMA. With the Data Act, sort of is kind of the DMA principle applied to the cloud, and I think these are signals that the TTC is not being taken seriously by all partners, and that we ought to view it as a true vehicle for fostering a productive transatlantic relationship. I don't think it's that yet.
Eva, do you agree? I mean, you did mention several issues like data flows, maybe AI, which we could discuss as well. Do you think that there is a possibility to get real transatlantic agreement on these issues, which so far perhaps have divided us? If you take AI as well, which you're very involved with, the new artificial intelligence proposal puts sort of restrictions on what high risk programming, and America is not going in that direction, and doesn't seem to be anywhere close to regulating AI. Are we fated to disagree?
Well, so I think we need to find areas where bringing forward definitions, for example, on AI that would help businesses do and produce their products, be it in Europe or in the US, wouldn't necessarily make a difference, or sell them wherever they would like to sell them. So I think we need to, focus on areas where we could find agreement. And I think that when it comes to the definition of AI, we could look for international forums where, the definition can be crafted by democratic allies, like in the OECD, for example. And ideally, Europe and the US decide to go ahead with that definition. So I also think, and let me tell you what's my approach on the AI Act. I work on it, again, in the industry committee. Yes, indeed, it's the first ever legislation on AI. I think the Commission initially wanted to have it presented after 100 days since it initially started its term, and it delayed it for quite some time. And I'm glad it delayed it, because I don't think we need to, get into an area too fast. And as I said, sometimes we might have been a bit slowed down in some other areas. So what I would like to do is to avoid a heavy hand of over-regulating. We, of course, play catch-up when it comes in that sphere with US, with Chinese investments. But I want to make sure that there is breathing room for industry to make sure they can research, they can create, in order for European or whichever industries decide to make AI made in Europe, so to say, they could keep their pace with the rest of the world. And one issue that I introduce in my report is the sandboxes and the sandboxing principle. It will be important that those that are developing the products in this space have a safe space to explore basically the art of what is possible to make. We are also trying to encourage, and we make them in a way central to the report, the SMEs' role in advancing AI. And we're giving them the opportunity for their voice to be more heard, to be more represented in the development of AI while building rules around it. And as with all European regulation, of course, we want that this regulation reflects our values and norms. I think we would all hate being here on this call if someone else crafts those norms and values, be it China or Russia nowadays, for example. So this is why I think we have to be clear on what is not acceptable in AI. For example, when it comes to profiling that may lead to discrimination, AI that is not human-centric. I think these are important points. Yesterday, I actually presented my report in committee, and all groups gave a lot of positive feedback to start with. Of course, we're still going to work on it, and work will continue in the next couple of months. But I just wanted to share with you that, regulating AI doesn't mean we're going to put such strict rules that it will be impossible for the product to continue developing.
Thanks. Adam, I think we're heading towards our conclusion. So each of you, I guess we'd like to conclude. We've gone over the differences. When you hear all the differences between the American and European approach, Adam, be it on antitrust or regulating gatekeepers, on AI, where we're not moving towards any type of regulation soon, do you think that the transatlantic alliance can be a digital alliance as well? And in what areas would you privilege working?
I definitely think it can be. I think, as Ms. Maydale commented, AI is a prime area where there is going to be a lot of alignment between American and European values, and we should band together as a counterweight to kind of the China-Russia axis on those issues. I think there is a better path forward. Particularly at the upcoming TTC meeting in Paris, to ensure that transatlantic security and geopolitical considerations kind of guide the development of the DMA, of the Data Act, of new cloud security measures, of the AI legislation, and that hopefully policymakers, both American and European, kind of take this moment to elevate the debate on technology regulation and say, look, what we face big geopolitical threats here, right? We actually have a common interest in promoting democracy. We don't want VK to become the world's leading social media service, right? That would be bad for democracy, for human rights. And so how are our regulations maybe unintentionally leading to undesirable results? So, I think kind of making sure that our policymaking, our transatlantic policymaking, is driven by our shared values around human rights, free expression, democracy, and not by kind of a singling out of the American big tech firms. Because I think that if it comes right down to it, both Europe and the US have a shared interest in Western companies being making these calls and not Russian and Chinese companies.
Ms. Medell, Eva, how would you conclude? Are you convinced that we can avoid a split over regulation of big tech, or is Europe intent on getting Google, Facebook, and others, or a transatlantic alliance? How can we avoid the split?
I mean, it will be nice if we can think about our cooperation not just in terms of, the few big tech companies. So I would like to see our cooperation, going beyond some of the topics we've discussed today. And of course it does. But of course, for me, as someone that is so much focused on some of those tech files, it will be important to see less protectionism from the side of the EU, more openness, more readiness to collaborate. Because one might think there is such, but sometimes you're doubtful when you hear different representatives speak. And so I think what is going to be defining is our actions in some of these key areas. And yes, on one hand, we're going to be delivering some quite serious regulation. But on the other hand, I think there is the opportunity to work on a number of projects, be it in the semiconductor sphere or in the AI sphere, that could show really that on one hand, we put values, and on the other hand, we put supply chain, and and finally, we put, the opportunity to, renew, so to say, maybe the TTC is our new coal and steel community, find a new momentum in the relationship. So it will be good to see both sides of the Atlantic. And not only, it will be nice to bring other democratic allies in this endeavor as well, because we see that in a ever more divided world, the more we try to isolate ourselves, the more, citizens will benefit less, companies will benefit. It's just so simple what's going to happen. So I would like to see, more discussions, but then walking that talk finally. And this can only happen through concrete projects. And again, I would like to call for the TCC to come up with projects that are tangible, that have a clear timeline, and that can be executed. And I believe such projects exist. And so instead of meeting every 6 months, perhaps some of those meetings on key decision makers can be done in more often, but we need to see progress, and we need to show that the digital sovereignty could be a digital sovereignty for all democratic allies.
Thank you very much. Let's stay tuned for the next TTC meeting, and let's hope there are concrete agreements on data flows, on regulating big tech, digital tax, and a lot of the things that we didn't even have time to discuss. So thank you, Adam. Thank you, Eva. Thanks for taking the time and for your to discuss these important issues. I'd like to turn it back now to Alina in Washington, who will be joining us with Tumu, who's the White House Special Representative for Technology and Competition Policy. And he's going to have a fireside chat. Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Hello again, and thank you, Bill, MEP Maydell, and Adam for that fascinating conversation. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. And I'd like to welcome you to this fireside chat with Mr. Tumu, who's currently the Special Assistant to President Biden for Technology and Competition Policy at the National Economic Council. Tim, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us for this chat. You weren't always in government, I know. You're also a very prolific writer. You've published 4 books, if I'm not mistaken. You were a professor of law at Columbia. You were a candidate for lieutenant governor of New York. And your most recent book is The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust in the New Gilded Age, that came out in 2018.
Yes. something like that.
With so many books, you never know. So Tim, thanks again. Thanks for taking the time. I know you're super busy in your current role in the administration. So I just want to get right into it.
Sure.
Everyone knows, I think, that you've been a key thought leader in digital policy throughout your career in academia and public policy as well, especially on issues of competition policy and internet freedom. You, in fact, coined the term net neutrality. So congrats on that. That rarely happens. You get to coin a term.
Many, many years ago and by accident.
But still here, and we still use it. And you've been an advocate for, I think, a revision of our competition policy more broadly in the United States now in your role in the Biden administration. But I want to start off with something else that you've been doing that I think is worth highlighting before we get into some of the details. Of course, we're having this discussion not just in the context of tech policy, but in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which most of us have been completely consumed by. But I think this also presents an opportunity for us to discuss, what is the role of technology in having a proper democratic alliance between Europe and the United States in particular when it comes to how we set the rules of the road around technology policy and uses. I think one of the efforts that's been really interesting that I want you to talk about to get us started is something called the Alliance for the Future of the Internet. This effort, as far as I understand it, tries to build a coalition to defend a democratic digital domain. Of course, it's incredibly relevant today, seeing what's happening in Russia and China. And to be sure, there have been also other efforts in the space over the years. So tell us what the Alliance for the Future of the Internet is, what makes it unique, and why is this the right moment to be thinking about it?
Yeah, I think just to start, there could not be a better moment for bad reasons. But we have seen in the unprovoked, very violent attack on Ukraine that one of the victims has been internet freedom and some of the basic principles you might have thought were to be respected with respect to the internet. And so, we have seen a period where it's very clear that there is a contending model out there of how states should behave with respect to the internet, a more authoritarian, sometimes it's called the Internet Sovereignty Model. Mm-hmm. And it merely sees the Internet as yet another tool of state power, as opposed to sort of encouraging free speech. It's used to control and censor speech, instead of encouraging democracy, used to spy on dissidents and so forth. So that's the challenge. And the time has come, I think, for the democracies of the world to sort of forcefully state what they believe in, forcefully state what they believe are appropriate principles for nation states, shalls and shall nots with respect to the internet. So that is the basic idea behind the alliance, to have a declaration of these basic principles. And, as I said, the time could not be more important. We've seen, we've had a longer history with China, asserting its sovereign will over the internet in various ways, and the trajectory has not been good. And I think now is the time to turn the page.
Well, let me stick with this idea of technology really not just being about regulation, but really about tech geopolitics, right? Which you're alluding to, discussing where China has been in its model of digital authoritarianism. This is a term we usually use. Obviously, we've seen in the last several weeks a pretty aggressive clampdown by the Russian government as well that is now banning any Western independent social media, trying to control information, surveil citizens, and clamp down on any independent voices. So you've pointed out over and over again that the technology policy isn't just a domestic issue for the reasons we're discussing, and that we really need to think globally and work together to make sure it's democratic norms that are driving the development and innovation of technology. But, just picking up on what you just said, I just wonder, how can we do that effectively? Because if we look at, people that live in China, Chinese citizens or Russian citizens and others across the world, their version of the internet is not our version of the internet anymore. And we've been building towards this for a long time now, unfortunately. I mean, the Great Firewall of China started in the 1990s, right? So is there still an opportunity here to really have a global, open, democratic digital domain? Or have we just gone too far towards the kind of splinternet, fragmented internet sovereignty model?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I want to answer in sort of a broader context. President Biden has often said we're in this struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. And you might take from that, well, isn't it hopeless? Aren't some countries just going to be authoritarian, and that's the way it's going to be? And I don't think we don't think so. We are optimistic about the long-term prospects for democracy, and not to realize that internet policy is a vital part of that struggle is a mistake. I think it's sometimes missing. We sort of leave it out. But very much one of the front lines of the battle over the next 10 years between authoritarianism and democracy will be in this question of how the internet ends up being treated. So, we'll we declare principles and say a few things, in Russia and China, other countries, just scream, oh, no, you're completely right. Sorry, you're wrong. It's not going to happen like that. I also don't think I think we were more naive and maybe in the 90s, maybe sort of hoping this would sort of naturally self-execute or it was impossible for the internet to be controlled. No, I think we're much more conscious. And I take this back to democracy. We're also conscious that democracy itself is not just you wave some magic dust and hold one election and you're done. It's a serious challenge. It's like the challenge of the next decade.
And of course, the Biden administration has a very robust democracy agenda, and we're in the midst of the year of action. Obviously, the war in Ukraine has taken up a lot of attention, as it rightfully should. But thinking about the role of technology in our broader democracy agenda, as you say, is going to be key. But I want to, let's dig into it a little bit, because we're really now talking about, I think, the role of governments and what can governments do to build an alliance around democratic norms and principles when it comes to the online space. But of course, you've written multiple books talking about the tension that exists between what governments can do and then what the private sector has done and can do. And of course, we've seen in the United States that innovation for a long time has not been driven by government investments like it was perhaps in the 1950s. And we've really transitioned to a situation where we have private sector driving innovation and technology. And I don't think that is ever going to change at this point. So my question to you, and since you thought so much about this, you've been advocating for something called competitive innovation as kind of a newish model, I should say. It's a new old model, but we can talk about that, for how to think about the relationship between government regulation and companies. And one of the points you often make is that, we've gone too far into the phase of monopolies and the assumption that monopolies can drive innovation. So can you talk a little bit about what competitive innovation is and how that would be an effective way to engender technology innovation so we can continue to compete with countries that are quickly moving in the authoritarian direction like China?
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate that question. The United States and this administration, I want to be clear, have long had, and at our best, have had an industrial policy that is a bet on competitive innovation. And what that means is essentially the opposite of a national championship policy. Is we don't say, okay, we believe in this, one company that they've got it all figured out and they're going to become, our champion for the future. We believe in ecosystems. We believe in a competitive environment. We believe in always, even if you have a great company that happens to have accomplished dominance of its market, it needs to have its feet held to the fire of competition in order to stay good. Right. One way or another, it's a win-win. And we've been at this, some version of this policy, let's just say over the last 50 years, has been successful. Back in the 70s, 80s, it was AT&T, IBM. They were the champions. Right. We didn't say, all right, let's just make sure that, we were facing Japan at the time. We didn't say, all right, well, they're the winners. We broke up AT&T, right. And we put AT&T, IBM through the ringer. So that is the policy. It's the opposite of national champion. I think that is, the track record shows, this is my historic side, that has been a winning strategy for this country over the last, frankly, over the last century. And I think as we meet challenges from China, from other countries, that for this country, and this was affirmed in our administration's policy, is the best path going forward.
You mentioned two things, and thanks for clarifying that. You mentioned two terms that I think I just want to pick up on for a second. You mentioned the sovereign internet model or internet sovereignty models that goes by different names, but we've also seen Beijing kind of champion this idea. Interestingly, we've also seen Europe talk about digital sovereignty, which is perhaps slightly different, but sounds very similar.
Right.
And the other term you use is this whole national champion model, historically not being a successful model for engendering an ecosystem approach to innovation. And of course, in Europe, the national champion model still seems to be dominating. When we're hearing discussions that are very actively going on as we speak about what Europe's role in the world is, we often hear these terms like digital sovereignty and national champions because, of course, American companies dominate so much of the tech industry right now. And when you're looking at it from the French perspective, perhaps, or the German perspective, you want your own national champions, right? So it just strikes me that you see this as not a very effective historical model, but yet this is how the policy is still being perceived, and that's the vision driving like European policy. So I just wanted to ask you, Europe is such a key, indispensable ally when it comes to having cooperation in the digital agenda. But Europe has also moved very rapidly in its own regulation policy, like Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, all these things that have been coming out over the last several months. Don't need you to comment on the specifics of those very complex legal documents. But how do you see where Europe is heading in terms of the broader context of having the U.S. and Europe on the same page?
It's a good question. I think first I should say I think Europe we are very much on the same page with a lot of the stuff that the Alliance and Declaration is concerned with. I think we've been working with our European counterparts, and we have, I think, a very extremely good relationship and extraordinary level of agreement on the idea that there are basic principles that countries should not be violating. And these are low-hanging fruit. These are like you should not be interfering with other countries' elections. Right. You should not be censoring legitimate news sources. You should not be spying on dissidents and imprisoning them. These kind of based, frankly, human rights norms, constitutional norms. So we're in great agreement on those issues. But I think what you're alluding to is a sense that, does it go too far or something if Europe is interested in promoting competition? Obviously, there's been people who've been critical. I'll say this much. Europe has been interested in promoting competition within its own economy. Frankly, we are thinking about doing the same thing itself. There's bills in Congress related to market dominance and marketplaces. So, there's a big difference, I would say, between these sort of fundamental norms, like not interfering with other countries' democratic elections, not using the internet, not censoring basic speech, and countries who have an interest in legitimate sphere of regulation. And I think that's where the complication lies. But we wouldn't, and I'm not going to recommend to Europe how they go forward. I would just say that we're all trying to figure out best how we deal with the really challenging questions of market dominance by large firms. Yeah.
Well, let me follow up with a question I just thought of as you were speaking, because you have your historian hat as well. I think one unique thing about what's happening in the EU right now in terms of how they're approaching competition policy is that, I don't know, this is my question to you, if we have precedent for this in the past where you have, governments regulating companies that are from another country, right? So we have a situation emerging in Europe where most of the companies that they have concern with, of course, are the largest tech firms, and those just happen to be U.S. firms. You can make the argument that these are global companies, et cetera. But do you think that sets up a strange dynamic for perhaps limiting what the United States can do in terms of policy if we already have, a very clear regulatory agenda from Europe and we're still in the U.S. debating what our next steps will be on regulation? Do you see that as a limiting factor when you have rapid movement by Europeans in terms of what we'll be able to do on policy and regulation.
I mean, some of the preamble for this is privacy, for example, where obviously Europe has taken much stronger steps than most of the United States to regulate. I think that, and I think the position is that we have not seen this as limiting. I think that, the United States still has, and Congress, has the room to do what they want to do domestically. It is an ongoing question, and I think you raise it, and it's a serious question as to what point does a country's legitimate domestic regulation, which I think, obviously within your borders, you have some right to do things as a democratically elected state. To what point does that, spillover effect become something that becomes a serious question? But I don't know if we've reached that point yet. I don't want to deal in hypotheticals, but I do. I think it's an important thing to raise, and it's an important question for the future. In all these spaces where you can imagine, I mean, it's not just tech, but in so many areas, you have a small number of firms which are sort of globally dominant, and countries take their pick. I just think the answer can't be therefore nobody can do anything, right? That would be contrary to what democracy is about. The people rule if they want to, if they feel that. I don't know, maybe it's a pharmaceutical company, maybe it's an ocean carrier.
Right.
You're going to say they have no right to have any regulatory authority over them because they're a global company. That can't be the outcome.
Right.
But, as to what the trade-offs are, we're still working on that.
Right. No, I think it's a good way of framing the conversation because it is, I think it's an unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in and how we think about, we're all dealing with questions around, a similar set of companies, a similar set of issues around, data use, AI, privacy, digital rights, all these different things. And the more that we're aligned as first and foremost as transatlantic alliance, but then of course as a global coalition of democracies, which is of course exactly what AFI tries to do, the better off we'll be in our ability to ensure that people have equal access, digital rights, and human rights are enshrined in some of these international norms. So I think that remains to be seen what happens there. But let me just ask you one final question, because what I find so interesting is that there's a lot of doom and gloom in the conversations these days, especially around tech regulation.
Right.
And we've seen some very public debates, some private debates, certainly between Europe and the United States, but also globally. And you, however, remain very optimistic. And I've heard you say this before, and you alluded to it in our conversation earlier on. What makes you optimistic about the future? Because I think sometimes we look at China and we're like, oh my God, they're going to eat our lunch on all these different technologies. The internet is not going to be the free and interoperable internet we all imagined in the early days of this, right? Social media isn't leading to democratic movements and democratization of everything, right? It's also used for malicious purposes, the dual use nature. We just have only recently truly recognized what that looks like. So what makes you optimistic about the future?
I'm optimistic because I'm optimistic about democracy, and in particular on one feature of it, which is its self-correctional feature. One thing I'd say about democratic governments and free markets is we have the ability to realize when things have gone too far and start to go in a different direction. And, I think that's what we're doing. I agree. There was a lot of optimism. The future was going to be perfect. Historically, that's happened before. And historically, we've had to trim the sails a little bit and keep sailing. But I am very optimistic over the long term about the prospects for us to improve the way things are. And about democracies which respond ultimately to sort of a felt popular sense that something's not right. Now, we may not ultimately fix everything, but you have these course corrections where like maybe this is too much power concentrated in too few entities, or maybe something about the way social media is developed is not creating a healthy ecosystem for democracy and for good discussion. Now, the problem is if you just keep course and say, no problem, everything's fine, the dream of the 90s is still there, you're just not seeing it properly. That's where you get to real trouble. And I think we're in a course correction, and I think that's why I'm optimistic, because it says good things about the long term.
So it's as if we were all maybe in hindsight naively optimistic about technology and democracy. Now we've gone completely 180 into doom and gloom, and you're saying we're going to find the middle ground somewhere in between in the years ahead.
Yeah, and I guess that comes from spending a lot of time reading very long-term histories of things. But, fundamentally, I think technology has the potential to improve the human condition.
That's
right?
Yeah.
And as long as we have governance structure, and frankly, firms which are responsive to the human condition, are made to be responsive to it through democratic levers or just through feedback, we should be able to find a way back towards improving the human condition. And that's what I think we all should want to do.
Exactly. And I think we have to keep that kind of as the vision that guides us, because I find a lot of conversations these days, it's so doom and gloom as if we already ceded the territory to saying, okay, look, all technology is evil. It's not for the common good and the public good. But, I think we have to cede that back and take it back and say, no, actually, technology is capable and will improve the human condition and will make societies more democratic. It just depends on, we have to have that winning vision at the end instead of ceding the ground before it's even there to be ceded
right.
To authoritarian states.
It may not be version 1, and also it may require things like rethinking business models or parts that, get out of control. But I think we can get there.
Well, Tim, I rarely get to end these conversations on an optimistic note. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for having this chat with me and with SEPA today, and for previewing what you have in the plans for the Alliance for the Future of the Internet. Look forward to hearing more about it in the weeks and months ahead, and good luck. It's not an easy task you have ahead of you, but really confident after speaking to you in particular that we'll persevere as democracies, and we'll find our way back to a middle ground that works, that enshrines our values and principles and human rights as well. So
right. Well, watch this space. There's more coming soon, and we're not done. And thanks again for having me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.